Over the last 2 years, I've spent countless hours trying to learn how to create 3D anime. It's a task that can either look great or fall flat on its face. And even though it's just a few finished animations, each project taught me a ton about what it takes to capture a 2D look in 3D. How different you have to treat the 3D animation and what separates the bad from the great 3D anime. This video is a compilation of all those projects, so you can watch, learn, and hopefully enjoy the first chapter of my journey to master the art of 3D anime. And it all started with, this is one of the scenes from the Ghibli movie Spirited Away, but it's actually 3D. Here's another one, also 3D. How about this one? There are so many YouTube tutorials on how you can create the 2D Studio Ghibli style in 3D, but none of them combine all of them to create a full scene. Is it too hard? Does it take too long? Or is it something you just shouldn't do? Well, while I was creating these 3 scenes, I realized the answer is maybe more complicated than I thought. The first scene looks pretty simple. An island, some clouds, and a lot of water. Looking at the movement, it looks like the shot has been painted in 3 layers. The island in the foreground, the closest clouds in the midground, and the rest of the clouds in the background. And that's pretty simple to recreate in 3D as well. The whole shot has a very painterly feeling, almost like a Bob Ross painting. There are a few different ways to paint in Blender, and for this project I decided to use texture painting. Unfortunately, Blender's default paintbrush looks pretty boring, but there are a few settings you can tweak to give it some more character. I expected very little from these settings, but you can actually customize more than I thought. With a custom brush mask, texture, and pressure sensitivity settings, you can create some pretty good looking stuff. My favorite setting out of all of them is probably the gradient color. This switches between the colors of the gradient based on the pressure you apply to your tablet. This makes it super easy to add some subtle color variation to any surface. And with my selection of brushes ready, it's time to paint. All complex things start very simple. Laying down the most basic colors first will define the silhouettes and shapes of the shot. And that's all you really need to nail the composition. At this point you can already see whether you get close to the original or if you need to make some adjustments. I was feeling pretty good about my layout, so after a quick last check, I went back in and started refining. This is the most fun part of the painting process, at least for me. Now it is time to capture all the intricate details, the variations in color, and the well thought out brush strokes that make the shot look so beautiful. While the big shapes define the overall mood, the details add history to every object. It invites you to think about all these stories that have happened here and really helps you immerse yourself into the world by making it feel like life goes on, whether you are there or not. And after animating the camera as well as the water and repositioning the clouds, the first scene is done. While I was researching all the tricks and techniques that the studio uses to create their movies, I stumbled onto a quote by Hayao Miyazaki, the man behind all the Ghibli movies. I believe that the tool of an animator is the pencil. He's famously known to stay away from computer-generated images as much as possible. So my idea of trying to recreate one of his movies with nothing but a computer is probably not something he would like. But maybe I can show that there are benefits to these newer technologies. If I was better at painting, I think I could have almost perfectly recreated this shot. But I'm not sure that this would be much quicker than doing it traditionally. So this shot alone probably wouldn't be enough to convince Miyazaki. But of course, we're just getting started. Most shots in Spirited Away are separated into 2 art styles. The static objects that don't move throughout the shot and the dynamic ones. And after the first purely static shot, it's time to add some dynamicism. Traditionally, you would have to paint the characters multiple times over multiple frames to create a scene. But in 3D, you only need to create it once and can then use that model for every necessary scene. But the problem with Blender is that it is optimized for realism. So we basically need to trick the program into a more hand-drawn style. For that, we need 3 main ingredients, and the model itself is the foundation for the other 2. Just like the first scene, I started by blocking out her body, then refined it by merging all the individual shapes and adjusted them in scope mode. And for her, the most basic anatomy was enough, since most of it is hidden under clothes anyway. While I was cleaning up the geometry by retopologizing the model, I learned from a few tutorials that the only thing that really matters in non-photorealistic renders is the end result. Very differently to realistic projects, the object's geometry doesn't really matter, which actually gives you a lot more freedom in how to create your project. The second ingredient for non-photorealistic projects is a great example. Just like most anime or comic styles, Spirited Away also has line art. Chihiro's nose, for example, is only really visible because of a few lines. These extra lines give the characters more structure and make it easier to distinguish between the shirt and hair, for example. In Blender, these lines can be automated. Just add a grease pencil object to your scene and give it the line art modifier. Now you can select what you want to outline and voila! It basically adds a line in front of every sharp edge of the object that is visible to the camera. Now the goal is to change the model in a way that makes the line art look as good as possible. Adding geometry to make them smoother, smoothing out surfaces to remove unnecessary lines, nothing matters except for the final look. And after a few more details, there's only one more ingredient left. Most characters consist of two colors, the base color and the shadow color. No gradient between the two, just a straight line. And all you really need to create that is a super simple shader setup. And there you go, looks pretty good. But if you want to go even further, you can either adjust the geometry again to create more desirable shadows, or if you really want to optimize the model, tweak the normals of the object. Normals tell the surface in which direction it's facing, which is used to calculate the object's shadows, for example. I mainly use that to add some more custom shadows or to get rid of some that aren't in the original. And with 3D Chihiro looking like the original, it's time for her to move like her as well. After creating a custom rig and failing to properly add weight painting the first time around, she's ready to be animated. So with the help of the original, I tried to copy the movement as closely as possible to my version. Until I realized something. Her arms in the original are way too long. The more I tried to trace her movements, the more I noticed how wrong the anatomy actually is. And it's not just the arms. But obviously, without a 3D model to compare it to, it doesn't feel wrong. The position her arms are in the original actually makes it feel more intimate. I guess if you have to draw all the poses manually, you can also change the anatomy a bit to make them more expressive, or to just make it look better visually. Unlike her body, the shirt needs a few more adjustments. Throughout the shot, you can see how the folds in her shirt shift and change. The easiest way to achieve that in 3D is with shape keys. Shape keys basically allow you to change the shape of an object over time. So for her shirt, I create the pose in the beginning, and whenever it reaches the point where it needs to be adjusted, I create a new shape key and adjust it. And once that's done for the whole shot, it looks like the cloth is actually reacting to her movements. The last thing missing is her mouth. And this is where the 3D model fell apart. The shapes her mouth get into in the original really don't work in 3D. On top of that, I also just really suck at rigging a face. The only thing that saved this from being a train wreck were once again shape keys. But even then, to make it look somewhat similar to the final camera view, I really had to push the model to its limits. Luckily, it worked out somehow and looked somewhat decent in the end. Haku follows basically the same process as Chihiro, but I found a few tricks that made him look even better. For these internal lines, for example, I added these extra planes that stick out of the main body. Because of the way the line art modifier works, these will be rendered as simple lines, which made creating his fur a lot easier. For his green mane, for example, I just placed a simple plane on his head and cut a fur shape into it with the knife tool. Another pretty subtle but effective trick is the displacement modifier. With this setup and a simple cloud texture applied to it, the model wobbles around a tiny bit, which means that the characters are never perfectly the same between frames. This subtle imperfection happens in every traditional film, so it's important to add that in 3D as well. The animation is almost done, all that's left now is the last final touch. Since the grease pencil outlines are created automatically, we can now apply them to the animation and adjust them manually. This is also the last moment where any big issues can still be fixed. The automatic lines, for example, aren't perfect, so I cleaned them up a bit. Her mouth still looked a little rough, but that can be fixed as well. And the biggest issue of all, the shadows, which still look a little weird in some moments. I even used this opportunity to add some more details in Chihiro's hair and Haku's fur, which in the end looked like this. The good thing is that you only have to create each character once, which saves a lot of time, but it also has that distinct 3D perfection that you have to fight against to create something that looks more handmade. I guess you could say the 3D version takes less time and is more accurate, but it lacks a bit of freedom when it comes to how you can express emotions and movement. I think for this one it's pretty clear which one Miyazaki would prefer, but I have one more technique I want to try. This scene is kind of a hybrid between the first two. It has the painterly static environment, but this time the characters actually interact with it. To combine both of them, we first need the environment without any dynamic elements. And now we can turn this terrain into a 3D environment. Step 1. Separate the image into a foreground, midground, and background. Step 2. Model the environment very roughly in 3D space. And step 3. Project the original image onto the 3D environment. And there you go. The environment is already done and looks just like the original. Well, because it is. The rings that swing from left to right are also pretty simple. First, I need the ring model itself, which isn't that hard to create. Then I need an extra rail that I can attach the rings to. Placing a cylinder in the same position and projecting the texture onto that basically did the trick. And now I can wrap the rings around it, duplicate them, and rotate them around the pole. Since I have already created Chihiro before, I can just use her in this scene as well. All she's missing right now are her shoes and shorts. I adjusted the pose a bit so that it looks good in camera view and placed an extra lamp in the scene to bring out her lighter colors. And now the last thing missing to really place her in the scene is her shadow. Since the environment itself isn't affected by any lights in the scene, I just model a shadow manually, which is basically just a transparent black plane. Lastly, Chihiro's companion, No Face, wasn't really a challenge either. And all that's missing now is the animation. First, I slightly move the camera from left to right to bring movement into the foreground. Then I bend the midground a bit to add this slight parallax effect you can see through the door. There are definitely benefits to using 3D for your 2D animation work, and you can definitely do it better than what I have created in this project, but I think there's always a certain amount of authenticity and expressiveness that you will miss out on no matter how good you make it. So I might not be able to convince Miyazaki to change his opinion, but maybe that wasn't the best way to approach it anyway. I guess the best use of any given tool is not to try to recreate the style of a different tool, but rather to utilize its strengths to create a look that is inspired by other ways of creating. Imitation can only really get you so far. The best style you can create is still your own style. This first project taught me the basics of creating a 2D looking 3D animation, but it also showed me a ton of things I could improve on, like the character rig for example. So for the next project, I wanted to not only fix those shortcomings, but also be a bit more ambitious with the final result to see how far my newly acquired skills could get me. And maybe I was a little too ambitious with this. Is a shot from the manga series Berserk, but in 3D. But this shot is only a small part of a much bigger project where I wanted to animate a scene from the manga using my favorite 3D program, Blender. There are amazing examples of awesome looking 2D animations that utilize 3D, but there are also just as many not so great looking ones. Things can go wrong very quickly, which I unfortunately had to learn myself during this project, and to truly understand why, let's go back to our friend Guts. I've already played around with creating a 2D animation in 3D a couple of times. Most recently, I remade a few shots from Spirited Away, but this time I wanted to create a full scene with multiple shots that flow into each other, which means that our friend Guts over here had to be much more versatile than anything I've created before. He had to succeed in 3 important aspects for this project to go anywhere other than the trash. He had to capture the likeness of the original, be able to be animated in the most extreme poses from the manga, and most importantly, of course, look 2D. To capture his likeness, I had to make sure that the proportions of my 3D model match with the original illustrations. The problem with this is that his proportions aren't always the same. Sometimes the facial features are more pronounced to achieve a certain effect. Other times the perspectives are so extreme that it's basically impossible to draw him perfectly proportional over a series of shots. So I collected a bunch of references and combined them all together to hopefully match most shots as closely as possible. For a manga character, he looks pretty realistic, except maybe for his eyes, so creating his body wasn't all that challenging. I started with a human base mesh and replaced the head with a custom one that I sculpted based on the references I had. The biggest challenge during this process was to keep everything in mind the model needed to be able to do at every step of the process. Right from the beginning, for example, I had to make sure that his face works with the line art that I'm going to add once I start animating. On top of that, the geometry in his face needed to be able to deform into those extreme expressions you can see in the manga. The problem with that is, since I can't animate him yet, I can't test whether what I think will work actually works. But at least he's starting to look like the original. And once I fine-tuned the shadows on his face to look more stylized, I was finally able to add a rig to him. Rigging has always been one of my weak points, which became really obvious during my Spirited Away project. To create something remotely decent for this project, I needed to step up my game, which brought me back to an old enemy, Rigify. When I was still new to 3D, I tried using Rigify a couple of times, but because I just didn't understand how the proper setup process and all the different bone collections work, I accidentally ruined some of my projects back then and swore to never use it again. Until now. This time I came prepared. I watched every video in the Rig Anything with Rigify playlist by CG Dive on YouTube, and after a couple of hours, it turns out that Rigify is actually pretty simple. The biggest problem in my Spirited Away project was the face. Rigify does most of that basically for you. And look at that, the geometry works pretty well, even for more extreme expressions. So with the head basically finished, the body was next. Modeling armor is very boring, so you don't have to suffer through that with me. So, once everything was done and rigged, Guts already hits 2 of his 3 requirements. Now onto the third and probably most important one. To make a 3D object look 2D, you want to imitate as many 2D style characteristics as possible while trying to keep it as 3D as possible. And in my experience, most of the 2D characteristics you want to imitate are the human aspects. If you are a traditional anime animator, for example, you would have to draw up to 12 individual frames for each second of your animation. So to save some time, you simplify the shading to 1, maybe 2 light and dark colors. And when you're drawing those shadows, your mind can simulate them as well as a computer can, so they're maybe a bit smoother and simpler than what they would look like in real life. Now, since you only have a limited amount of shades, the way you can add more details to any surface is with extra lines. And the further you go with this process, the closer you get to a 2D look. And at this point, Guts looked pretty good, but I was curious how far I could push his 2D look. So I picked an original illustration from the manga and tried to recreate it as closely as possible. And this is the end result, the shot you saw at the start. And with Guts finished and ready to be animated, it was time to get into the actual animation. But this will not just be a simple animation of a random scene. I wanted to make it a bit more difficult. The scene I wanted to recreate is the second fight between Guts and Zod, one of his more prominent enemies. And the reason I chose this scene is because it had already been animated before. This scene is featured in the Berserk anime adaptation from 2016. By most fans, it's considered to be a pretty bad anime overall, but not because of the story. The creators decided to heavily utilize 3D to animate it, and that just did not work out for them. So now I wanted to see if I can do it better. I think this comes pretty close to the original, but doing this also showed me where the limits of this 3D 2D style are. The extra lines and blood that I've added to his face look great in a single frame, but once you want to animate it, it looks 3D again. I would have to draw multiple of these line textures just to animate his mouth, mouth, so to not spend hundreds of hours more on this project, I'll stick to the more simple style, which I think matches the traditional 2D anime style better anyway. I also manually added some sketch lines around the existing line art, which definitely helps with the 2D look as well. First things first, let's create Guts' opponent, Zod. For Zod, I basically followed the same workflow that I did for Guts, but I had one more idea to make him look even better. I texture painted some small custom shadows. It actually added a lot more depth to his body. This doesn't work for all scenes, but for most it looks pretty good. And with both characters ready, let's start with the first shot. The scene starts with Guts slamming his giant sword down and Zod blocking it, which felt like the perfect opportunity to create one of these. It's basically a drawn out shot showing the impact and power of an attack. The first thing I needed is the environment. Basically just a few snowy mountains with trees in the background and one main mountain as the battlefield. To make the scene easier to compute, I actually rendered the background scene as a 360-degree image so that I can add it back in as a skybox around the main hill. That's a pretty common technique for video games as well. Speaking of the main hill, this is where things get a bit more complicated. In most anime, every shot is separated into dynamic elements and static elements, and both have their own art style. The dynamic objects are more simplified because they have to be drawn much more often, whereas the static elements, like the ground for example, are much more painterly and detailed. So I can't just use the same material for the ground that I've used for my characters. I had to hand paint a custom ground texture. Unfortunately, Blender's texture painting tools are very basic. All you really have is a simple round brush, which is exactly why I've created my own collection of custom texture paint brushes. It's supposed to be a grassy mountain covered in snow, so first I painted the grass layer. This oval brush added some nice simple variation, but looked maybe a bit too simple. So I used the sprinkle brush to add some more brown spots to represent the dirt underneath. Now, to give it some more depth, I wanted to see what it would look like if I used the leaves and clover brushes to add a lighter shade of green. It looked okay, but maybe more realistic than painterly, so I had another idea. I changed this dry brush from paint mode to smudge mode and mixed everything together, and that actually looked pretty good. Now for the snow on top, I added a second texture layer, used a square marker brush to paint in footsteps where the main battlefield is, and made it look like nice fluffy snow using this cloud brush. And after a few more finishing touches and some more models to decorate the scene, it is done. If you want to get this collection of 50 texture paint brushes for yourself, check out the first link in the description. I've designed it to make texture painting in Blender as fun and efficient as possible. Oftentimes for these kind of shots, the characters don't really move, only peripheral stuff like their hair and clothes are flowing in the wind caused by the impact. So once Guts and Zod are in the right position, I gave Zod's skirt a looping wiggle animation, and now we can get to the fun stuff, the VFX. First, we need a shockwave, or maybe even two. They're basically just spheres that scale outwards with a procedural shader applied to them. Then we need some sparks where the swords are clashing together. Next up, clouds of snow caused by the initial impact. And last but not least, this ball of thunder to really highlight the power of the impact. And this is what it looks like. I'm actually really happy with how this one turned out. But there's one thing that I've kind of glossed over in this scene that made quite a big impact on this whole project. To make my life a whole lot easier and save a ton of time in the future, I created most of the effects throughout this animation procedurally, meaning I can adjust various aspects of them on the fly and most importantly, reuse them for future projects, which was kind of a blessing and a curse at the same time. The effects look much better than what I could create manually, but they also took a long time to create, which meant I had less time to work on other shots for the final animation. I've used this shockwave debris system, for example, for the big chunks of snow after the impact, as well as the swords that are being flung into the air. It looks really cool, but also took a day and a half to figure out. I know that's just the drawback of creating reusable systems like this, but it feels like I'm wasting time every time I'm creating one of these. But that wasn't even the biggest time sink of this whole project. To really sell the rage and energy of the impact scene, I wanted to try and imitate the impact frames from the newer One Piece episodes. They just look so cool and intense. One thing that I saw in the comments under my Spirited Away video was that some of you mentioned how 3D animators often bend and break the basic shape of the characters to create more expressive poses. I really wanted to try that, so all I really cared about while animating Guts for this scene was what he looks like from the camera's perspective. It looks really weird from anywhere else, which I had to get used to at first, but it made creating very dynamic and expressive poses a lot easier. The last thing to bring this to the next level and transition us to the second part of the shot are manual line art lines using the grease pencil. This technique really elevated the motion and rawness here even more, and is also what I've used to create the One Piece style impact frames. In case you didn't know, creating something like this takes a long time. But I kind of underestimated how long this would actually take. In my case, it took 4 days of nothing but drawing to finish this scene. And the worst part is, I'm not even that happy with it. But if I ever decide to do this again for some reason, I'll have a much better idea for how to do it next time. Since there are too many scenes to cover them all in one video, I wanted to focus on one more. In this one, Zod lunges forward to attack Guts. I thought this was a great opportunity to create another super dynamic pose. The first poses were pretty simple, just some wind-up poses to create anticipation for the jump. And then within 4 frames, he jumps and is so close he can't even fit into the frame anymore. It looked fine like this, but then I started stretching and bending again. And everything just looked 10 times better. I also used another one of my procedural VFX to create this zoom lines effect to really create this feeling of speed and surprise. And to once again go back to the original style test, just like how I painted a custom texture to add more of these lines to Guts' face, this time I used a custom texture to add more shadows to Zod's face to make him look even more intimidating and really highlight his glowing eyes. Overall, it's a pretty simple scene to create, but it's probably one of my favorite ones just because of how it turned out. When I started this project, I was really confident that I could improve on the original 2016 anime. After finishing it, I'm definitely happy with my result, but I can understand how this adaptation might have turned out the way it did. I came into this project with a lot of ideas and inspirations from different sources, but not really a clear vision for the overall style. Which means that some of these scenes stylistically don't work as well together as they could have. Some of the decisions I've made also cost a lot of time that I could have spent working on something more impactful for the overall animation. I guess sometimes you just have to experience the same situation to really understand something or someone. There are so many small tips and insights that I learned during these projects that I can't all include in these videos. So recently what I decided to do is start a newsletter where I can cover all of them in more detail. If you want to get more detailed insights into my projects and the techniques and resources I discover while working on them, feel free to sign up and you'll get them straight to your inbox. And even if you don't want to sign up, you can still read all of my posts on my newsletter homepage. I've already published a couple, so you can check them out right after this video with the second link in the description. Even though this project didn't turn out as well as I'd hoped, there were still a lot of new things I've learned throughout the process. The rig has improved significantly, I've learned new ways to utilize Blender's grease pencil, and I started developing a collection of procedural 3D anime VFX that you can get yourself with the link in the description. All the things I've learned from the Berserk animation gave me the confidence to try to make another full animation. This time, creating a Deadpool anime. In my opinion, these two would work perfectly together, but somehow nobody has done this before. And now, with the Deadpool movie right around the corner, it's time to turn this idea into reality. I've recreated Spirited Away, Berserk, and even myself as an anime character before, and collected a ton of knowledge on how to create an anime in 3D over the past year. Now, it's time to put all this knowledge to the test and create an original anime based on Deadpool. The first thing I wanted to define was the style I was going for. It could be dark, it could be romantic, it could be epic. Knowing the general style makes it much easier to nail down the other elements afterwards. In my reference collection for this project, I collected everything I thought looks cool and could work together in one style. One big inspiration was the anime Promare. I'm a big fan of these super big and bold colors, so that developed into the foundation for the rest of the style. That, in combination with these super loose and sketchy fight scenes from the anime One Punch Man, I thought can create a style that is bright and colorful while still conveying the strength of the characters really well. Speaking of characters, the biggest issue with the characters in my previous projects was, well, this one was barely holding together, but for my Berserk project there was one big problem. When you look at these hands, they have a very sharp and defined structure. Even when there aren't too many lines, the shape of them is still well defined. But the way I set up my characters here created very smooth deformations in areas that aren't really supposed to be smooth. Look at this shot right here. The elbow is basically non-existent and the fingers look more like sausages. My main idea to fix that issue was to create a more defined body. Each body part is made up of clear lines that imitate what you would see in drawings to create a more distinct and stylized silhouette. This won't just help with the overall shape, but also create sharper shadows, which was another issue I ran into last time. There's a fine line that you always have to walk for these 3D, 2D projects where you want to take advantage of the benefits of 3D, but also have to be aware of the problems that those can create when you're trying to imitate a 2D style. When you're drawing a 3D object, it won't be perfect, so you have to add that imperfectness into the 3D model as well. Like for this armor plating, for example. If you imagine what it would look like, then you would probably think of something like this. But when you have to draw this thing hundreds of times, you probably just ignore that it has thickness and just draw a simple shape like this. So for the 3D model, I basically did the same. Most of Deadpool's gear is paper thin to avoid the look of this perfectly drawn 3D object. His guns are actually probably the hardest part of his whole character, since they are basically just more detailed 3D cubes, so it'll be hard to add some imperfections into them once they're animated. I already simplified them a ton to follow the same theme of easy to draw, but I think I'll have to do even more to make them look 2D. But of course, the 3D model is just one part of the equation. The way to turn this into this is with this setup right here. It is a very basic cell shading shader setup, but with this setup you can only really determine the highlight and shadow colors. So to add the leather bits of his suit, I painted a quick texture. It basically allows me to choose different colors for the white and black areas. But this technique has one flaw, which is right here on the edges. If you get close enough, you can see the pixelation of the texture. I could just make the texture much bigger, but I actually found a better way to fix this issue. To understand what I did, we need to switch gears for a second and look at this right here. Anime puts less emphasis on physically correct shadows, which 3D is very good at, and more emphasis on these things right here. Line art is often crucial to define the structure of a character, since it's much easier to draw the contours of a nose, for example, than having to create perfect shadows for every frame. This is one of the biggest issues with trying to create a 2D style in 3D. It's hard to create a decent line art automatically, and even then it doesn't look that great. Something I did in my Berserk project was to add line art as textures, but this only really works well from a certain distance. If you're too close to the character, the lines are way too thick, and if you're too far away, they almost disappear. I needed a technique that allows me to manually create these lines while also changing thickness depending on the distance. And these individual lines of geometry are the solution. The way to add line art to your 3D characters is with this grease pencil line art modifier. It checks for silhouettes and contours that the camera can see and draws a line over them. So, by creating this second layer of geometry lines that hover over the actual body, the modifier identifies those as contours and turns them into line art. Which is also the way to hide the pixelated texture edges. The line art lines just cover them, so you can't even see them. And now the model is ready to do some test renders to see what a final result could look like. And this is also where the last technique comes into play that turns Deadpool's look from good to great.
Kiss me in the rain tonight. I'm here at the borderline.
Something a lot of people have commented under my Berserk video is the lack of compositing. Compositing can completely transform your animation, but so far I haven't really spent much time learning how to do it properly. So for this project, I'm finally getting into it. First, we need something to edit. So now I can finally see whether Deadpool is animation ready or not. And he actually works surprisingly well. Look at the hands, for example, compared to before. Or the elbow, which now actually exists. To create these super dynamic poses, you have to almost break the rate, stretching and scaling his body to create extreme foreshortening like this. But for this kind of animation, an expressive pose is much more important than realism, so you actually have much more freedom in how you're posing the characters.
And I know you won't be picking up, but I just can't fight the feeling anymore.
And if you want to get some deeper insights into how to improve your own 3D anime scenes, make sure to check out my newsletter where I share all tips and tricks that I learned during these projects. Oftentimes I come across info that I've never seen explained anywhere else, and in this newsletter I can share that stuff in more depth than I ever could in a video like this. Click the first link in the description and check out some of my previous posts. I bet you'll learn something new. And now, to add that last bit of manual spice, I can edit and draw over the scene with a new grease pencil layer. I used this technique in my Spirited Away project where it basically fixed my horrendous model of Chihiro, and now here it allows me to add the last bit of refinement to make it look as good as possible. Well, before compositing, of course. To have as much freedom as possible, I render these shots in 3 layers: the background, colors, and line art. This makes it much easier to adjust specific parts of the final result, like adding a glow to the bright areas or adding a slight gradient between the shadows and highlights. I've played around with a few different techniques between all of these, so the final look isn't fully determined yet, but it looks somewhat similar to this. Last time I created the characters, environment, VFX, animation, and sound design all in one video. I think because of that, the end result was a bit lacking. This time I'm gonna split up the project into 2 parts. Deadpool obviously needs someone to fight, so I also created Wolverine already, which means that we have the characters and a concept for the final look. In the next video, we'll cover the environment, VFX, and obviously the animation itself. This is a scene from my Deadpool anime, and you know what? I hate it. This is a project that relies on the knowledge I've gained in the previous projects of this series. With every animation, I've learned more and more about how to create a 2D looking anime in 3D. The compositing, colors, and movement combined with what I already knew about 3D animation all culminated in this project. Now, after finishing it, I realize I might have to rethink almost everything I've learned so far. The goal was to create a Deadpool animation, but instead of something like this, it's supposed to look more like this. To make sure that I hit that goal, I created a plan for how exactly I wanted to create this project to make sure that I never run into any issues. Because, well, that's what plans are for, right? In part 1, I created the characters, the general style I'm going for, and developed what the final animation could generally look like. Afterwards, I realized that I was still missing 2 major things to be able to create the actual animation. The first thing might not be that obvious until you look around. Still can't see anything? Exactly. For the environment, my plan was to keep it pretty simple because I wanted to focus more on the characters rather than what's around them, so this should be good enough. My main inspiration here was this scene from One Punch Man. The second thing still missing is the storyboard. First, I wrote down my ideas in text and afterwards sketched out how these shots are roughly supposed to look like. In the end, there were so many shots that I set myself a 2-minute timer to draw each one of these. So don't come at me for how they look, okay? And there you go, the storyboard is also done. Here's my idea for the animation. The first scene starts with Deadpool, then Wolverine appears. But it's pretty clear that Wolverine is not here to talk. Deadpool doesn't mind a quick fight though, so he gets ready, but is surprised by Wolverine's speed. He's barely able to block Wolverine's attack, stumbles a bit, but now both are ready to fight. They clash together in multiple vicious attacks, during which both suffer some injuries. But the fight is not done yet. Deadpool dodges a series of Wolverine's attacks, jumps into the air, Wolverine jumps after him. Ready to cut him into pieces, Wolverine realizes that Deadpool's gone. He faked jumping to get his katana back. Now Wolverine is furious and turns into this fiery meteor of blades, falling towards Deadpool. Deadpool tries to break Wolverine's attack, but that just makes him even more angry. Nothing is stopping Wolverine at this point. The fiery meteor comes closer and closer to the ground, crashing into it and creating a huge crater of destruction. Sounds doable. Now I have a plan for how I want to create the animation and also what to create. During my last 2 anime projects, I've explored a couple of different techniques to create the traditional anime look. Now in this new animation, my plan was to combine the best parts from both of these. And for the first few scenes, I basically went through the full creation process to see if what I thought could work actually works. First, I 3D animate both characters how I sketched it out in my storyboard. Once that looks good, I add a 2D grease pencil layer. This layer sits in front of the 3D scene, which allows me to do some manual fixes to make the 3D models look more 2D. Any mistakes I see in the 3D scene, I can now fix manually by drawing over it. The plan for how I wanted to create this animation worked out perfectly. The only issue was that these first few scenes took quite a while to create. I finished 3 scenes in 5 days. With 48 scenes in total, this animation would take me almost 3 months. But the first few scenes will always take longer because I first have to get, good at this new workflow. And now that I knew that this workflow works, I decided to first 3D animate all scenes and afterwards refine them by drawing over them. For the animation, my plan was to focus on 3 main aspects that I wanted to make as good as possible. I generally started each scene by blocking out the basic poses first. They're the ones that really define the movement and look of an animation. Afterwards, I can fill in the gaps to make it nice and smooth. This interpolation of the in-between frames can speed up the process a lot, but it actually makes the animation too smooth. In traditional anime, artists save time by only drawing every second or sometimes even only every 3rd or 4th frame. This is one of the most important aspects of anime, so I had to emulate that here as well. I can use the interpolation to nail the pacing and rhythm, then afterwards save every 2nd frame and remove the others by disabling interpolation again. The second important aspect is the composition of the shots. Anime works with 2 different styles, a painterly static style and a more simple dynamic style. It takes much longer to create this kind of look, so any scene that includes it is generally more static. For every scene, you basically have to check which style you would use if it was a traditional anime, and if it would include the painterly style, the camera can't really move that much or the 2D illusion is broken. It's an interesting challenge trying to not make every scene too dynamic while also not making them too static. What helps with that is the 3rd aspect I focused on. Anime doesn't shy away from using over-the-top abstract effects to make scenes more dramatic. So I did the same, like this shot for example. or this one, which you've seen before. Going over the top with the impact and strength that a character has is what makes anime. But creating effects like this can take a long time. So I decided to create a collection of procedural anime VFX for myself and now you. They can speed up the process of creating stuff like this a lot and are built to be versatile. So one of these effects can be used to create a whole range of looks. I've designed them to be as simple as possible so that even if you've never used geometry nodes before, you'll be able to use these and create awesome looking effects like this one. If you're interested, feel free to check out the links in the description. There was a lot to get right for the animation, but even with all of that, the 3D animation still went by pretty quickly, just how I had planned. But after the first few scenes, I knew that the 2D layer is the step that takes the longest. Now that I have some practice though, I should be able to get through these much quicker. Maybe? The shader on the 3D model creates these stylized shadows which look pretty good. Maybe a little too good. Since the shadows in anime are drawn by a human, they are never really 100% physically correct, and sometimes even purposefully simplified. So the main goal with the 2D grease pencil layer is to add that human aspect back into it. Sometimes you have weird wobbly shadows, sometimes you have too many shadows, sometimes these shadows are too detailed. Now all of those can be fixed by drawing over them. The other big aspect of this step is to refine the line art. You can automatically create line art by using the grease pencil line art modifier, but those lines won't be perfect, so you need to refine them manually afterwards to get the best results possible. For every scene, I usually fix the line art first and afterwards refine the shading. It can be hard sometimes to not draw over the lines, but with enough patience, the first frame is done. Wait, the first frame? Yep. After spending 2 days on this shot, I realized that this will take much longer than I expected. If I continue to follow the plan I've made for myself, this animation will take me months to complete. I don't have months. I wanted to finish this in 1 month. I needed to find whatever technique I could to get this done as fast as possible. It started fairly slow. The next 2 scenes weren't as detailed, so I could save some time that way, but that won't make the following scenes any faster. In the next scene though, I learned a bunch of new techniques. If I integrate the 2D layer into the 3D scene, for example, I can make it follow the actual 3D model and fix this hand, for example, automatically. Speaking of automation, I can also automate some of the line art refining. Not the part where I remove unnecessary lines, but the ones where I add new ones. By adding these simple edges to the model, they will be picked up by the automatic line art modifier as lines and drawn automatically for each frame. This can actually save a ton of time in most scenes. There's also the interpolation tool. It allows you to interpolate the grease pencil frame in between 2 other frames. This way you can automate up to 70% of work that you otherwise would have had to do manually. If I knew any of these techniques from the beginning, I could have been at this point days ago. Before I finished a scene in 1 to 2 days, now I can finish 2 to 3 in a single day. I was zooming through these scenes. But even with these new techniques, finishing the entire animation would take way too long. So I decided to end it at an earlier point where it would still make sense. I actually live streamed this whole second part of the project up until this point. In one of the last scenes I had to refine, somebody asked if I had tried using the fill bucket. I tried using it a couple minutes earlier after somebody mentioned it the first time, but quickly gave up on it because I just didn't understand how it worked. After the second comment though, I decided to give it another shot, and this time I figured out how you're actually supposed to use it. In that moment I realized how much time I could have saved if I used this tool since the beginning. Hours and hours of painstakingly drawing within the lines could have been done with a single click. And what kept me from doing so was my plan. And because I knew of a way to do it, I never even considered that there might be a better way. After finishing this project, I started rethinking everything I do to find more of these habits that slow me down. And I actually found quite a few already. I can highly recommend you to do the same in your life. Start rethinking some of the tasks you're doing and see if there might be a better way to do them. You might be amazed by what you'll discover. After all of this, I do hate this project, but I also love it. It has taught me a hard lesson, but one I'm glad to have learned. I think this animation looks much better than the Berserk animation, but there's still a lot you can improve. And one of the things that people have mentioned the most is the compositing. Compositing can completely change what an anime looks like, but so far I've never really done it before. So for my next project, one big focus was to improve my compositing. And for that, I tried to figure out how One Piece does theirs. This is Luffy from the anime One Piece, but in 3D. I will use this model to recreate 4 scenes from the original anime. The first scene is the easiest, but it gets harder and harder from there on out, up to the point where I don't even know if I can recreate the last scene. I even spoke with a professional anime compositor to learn more about the post-production stage that One Piece goes through to achieve its unique look, like these uneven outlines. And even he said that the last scene would be impossible to recreate in 3D. Well, let's find out. My goal is to master the art of 3D anime. Let's see if I can recreate One Piece. Starting with a simple cube. At first, all that matters is to get the most basic proportions right. And in case you didn't know, Luffy doesn't look like a realistic human. So having the references in the background to capture his appearance is pretty important, especially for the head since it's so stylized. For now, I'll only focus on the front and side view since those are the angles that show the shape of his head the best. Any other angle can cause big problems in the future, but we don't have to worry about that just yet. Now all that's left is to refine it a bit by merging all the pieces together and sculpting the individual muscles. And look at that, that's how you can create his body. But of course it's obviously not done yet. There are 3 steps left to finish the 3D model. First, let's make the model actually look 2D by limiting the lighting to a single highlight and shadow color, just like the typical anime cell shading. The second thing missing is the hair, which was probably the weirdest thing I've modeled in a long time. The biggest problem with hair is that it can change its overall shape very easily, which is something that is pretty hard to do in 3D. Even just looking at these references, you can see how none of these are exactly the same. So I decided to just use one of these as my reference and try to recreate that as good as possible. But that meant I had a front view, but no side view. I can position the strands on 2 axes, but not on the 3rd. So I decided to just place each one somewhere around the head and connect them afterwards by filling the gaps between them. And the end result looks good enough, I would say. Which means that there's only one thing left to finish the 3D model, and it's probably pretty obvious what it is. And with that, the 3D model is done, but it doesn't really look that great yet. With a couple more changes though, it looks a lot better. These changes are not really part of the basic 3D model, but rather modifications to make it look more 2D. And let's explore what those are while creating our 4 shots. Starting with the simplest one. It's pretty static and doesn't include the face, which is usually the hardest part to remake in 3D. I overlaid the original shot over my camera and then tried to match the pose with my model as closely as possible. But very quickly it's obvious that you can't really recreate the pose by just bringing the limbs into the same position. Which is why it was so important that the skeleton for Luffy can not only put him into all kinds of poses, but even go beyond that and stretch his limbs to be even longer than normal. Only through basically overstretching the model was I actually able to recreate the original pose. When you're drawing, you don't really have to think about perfect proportions and just draw it how it looks the best. So even though the 3D model's proportions are more accurate, it still looks worse and you basically have to break it to achieve the best looking results. And this breaking of the 3D rules is one of the main things you do to make it look more 2D. You'll see many more techniques like this one in the other scenes, but we're not done with this one yet. After stretching him out a bit, after extending his limbs, it already looks much better. But a few things are still missing. First of all, we have his shirt that is waving in the wind. Creating good cloth movement can be pretty hard, but luckily these were actually pretty easy to make. I can use a wave texture and let that run along the edge of the cloth. This wave texture can then displace the geometry of that cloth to create the general wave pattern. Afterwards, I can just apply the same displacement again to make it rounder. If I now apply that to a shirt, it looks like this. And I think that comes pretty close to the original. But even with all these improvements, we haven't even talked about the one that makes the biggest difference. And all we have to do is add a grease pencil object to the scene. The grease pencil allows you to draw anywhere in the 3D scene. It also has a line art modifier. I don't think I have to explain what it does. But there's more. You can also freeze and adjust these lines in case you want to remove some or add more details, for example. Look how much better it looks after adding these lines. Now we're almost done with the scene. There's only one more thing left to do. With this thing, we can not only fix the weird shading on his body, but also add these extra detail lines and his hair, since the hair we have is white and doesn't really work for this scene. What can do all these things? It is once again the grease pencil. Not only can we use it for the line art, but also to basically draw over the 3D scene to fix anything that is broken on the 3D model. And we can do that by placing it in front of the 3D scene from the camera's perspective. Now anything that still looks a bit weird can be fixed, and very dynamic elements like the hair or the energy surrounding Luffy can be added by just drawing them. And it looks pretty good. But this is just the beginning. We'll have to break this model more and more as we go through these scenes up to, you'll see when we get there. One Piece often has very big and exaggerated expressions. Even though the skeleton itself is not able to do that, we can create them in a different way. First, we can bring the model and camera into the correct position to match the original. Then we can adjust the face to match the reference. Afterwards, we realize that we just wasted an hour because we need more than just one expression. So we ask ourselves if there's a way to make these adjustments optional so we can create multiple and turn them on or off with a single value slider. And look at that, we can do that with shape keys. But for these new expressions, we also need a new set of teeth, since the one I already made before doesn't really work here. The nice part about this art style is that stuff like the teeth are so simplified that it makes 3D modeling those much easier as well. But the teeth being so simple also created an issue. I could create individual teeth, but that can look weird from certain angles. There's actually a technique that I discovered during my Deadpool anime project that can add lines like these anywhere on the body super easily. There are a couple of extra options for the grease pencil line art modifier for what it should detect as lines. One of those options is this one. With this enabled, it can not only detect the edges of a mesh like the teeth, but also individual edges. Which means that I can place these single edges anywhere on the body and they get turned into lines. This way I can not only add the lines on the teeth, but also the scratches on his face. The main issue now is getting the lighting to look like the original, which in this case might not even possible. In 2D you can just draw highlights on his nose like that, but that isn't really possible in 3D without the rest looking weird, since 3D lines still behave somewhat physically accurate. There are ways to change how a model reacts to lighting to stylize it more, but those are very tedious to set up in my opinion. In this case, there was something much easier I could use. The basic material for each object has a highlight and a shadow color. Now to add custom lighting to the scene, I can just create 2 more materials, one for only highlights and one for only shadows. And I can use them just like the edge lines by placing geometry on top of the original model. With this, I can create shadows and highlights wherever I want and don't have to care about the lighting at all. This worked so well that I had to fix almost nothing with the grease pencil. These first 2 scenes were a great way to test out the general workflow for this project. And since these 2 worked out so well, I thought now it's time to push this model to the extreme. This whole scene from the anime is pretty crazy, but this shot right here especially was the one I wanted to recreate for this project. There are a couple of things that make this shot much harder than the first 2, and I wasn't really sure how I would solve these issues. The first one are the general shapes. The lines and shapes are much more sketchy and look like they've been drawn freestyle, where the first 2 scenes are much more straight and organized. The second thing is the pose. The first 2 are somewhat distorted and stretched, but this one takes that to another level. Lastly, the compositing. The chromatic aberration at the edges, the glowing eyes, the iris in the background, everything is just a bit more extreme here. So let's see if I can recreate it. At this point I gave up trying to match the pose without stretching the model. The new strategy was to match the most important body parts as closely as possible. Like his fist, head and legs. The rest then gets stretched to look as much like the original as possible. And as long as you don't leave the camera's perspective, it looks pretty good. The only problem that this stretching creates is that the limbs gets much thinner. But that's where we can use shape keys again to adjust their shape. Speaking of adjusting shapes, while we're already at it, might as well see if shape keys can also turn this rather clean mesh into these more sketchy shapes. The pants, for example, are much bumpier, so if we apply the same to the model, it matches the original pretty well. The hand is also much more defined. There wasn't that much geometry to play with for the hands, but despite that, I think it comes pretty close to the original. Lastly again, the face. After the last scene, I knew that this expression was possible, so now I just had to create it again. Now for the last point. I learned a lot about anime compositing by talking with Pilo, who works as a professional in this field. The first thing that surprised me is that he said that they usually get the entire footage in one layer. In my project, I can render my scene in multiple layers, like the line art and the colors, so I can have more control over each one. But since it's common to only get a single layer, they use 2 custom tools. To first select the line art and move it to its own layer, and the second one to fill the line art with the fill color to get a layer that has only the colors. Another question I had for ages was how One Piece creates these lines that vary in thickness. I always thought drawing them like that manually would take way too long, so there had to be a way to do this during the composition stage. And apparently the way they create these lines is in fact in compositing with the roughen edges effect in After Effects. For anime compositing in general, After Effects is the most common tool. But since I used DaVinci Resolve, I didn't want to buy another editing software, so I tried to recreate those effects. The only one I really needed to recreate was the roughen edges effect, which actually wasn't that hard to do. It doesn't look exactly like the original, but I think if I spent a bit more time on this, I can get it there. After a couple more glow effects and the chromatic aberration, this is the final shot. Now for the finale, the shot that Pilo said would be impossible to recreate in 3D. Just like the last one, this shot also takes the look from the first 2 and pushes it to the extreme. But that's not really the reason why Pilo said that this shot would be impossible to recreate in 3D. It would be impossible because of how it's been animated. Just like the last shot, this one is drawn in a much more freestyle way than most of the other scenes in the anime. This style makes the body look like it's warping constantly. Look at the stomach, for example. The abs look like one of those baking time lapses. Doing that in 3D, which loves consistency, would be impossible. Maybe. I didn't want to give up that easily, so I tried it anyway. But for now, only as a still frame. And here's why. In theory, you can create any shot as long as you can create each frame of it. The question would then be how much more time consuming it is compared to just drawing it. Since I wasn't sure if I can create the shot at all, I decided to attempt a single frame first. and I felt pretty bad for my 3D model. To match the face at all, I had to do some huge adjustments with the shape keys, which from any other angle looks very interesting. But as long as the camera perspective looks fine, it's okay. The other major part of this process were the 2D adjustments over the 3D model. I could have also created the shading with geometry like in shot 2, but decided to draw them instead. In the end, the shot looks like this. So in theory, the shot is possible. Now, my question to you is, would you want to see me attempt to recreate the whole animated version of this shot in another video? Maybe even both of these shots? Let me know in the comments, and if enough people vote yes, I will try to recreate the impossible shot. I still have some techniques I've never used before, so maybe for this scene it's finally time to use them. This brings us to the last anime project so far. With everything I've learned, I felt like in theory I can create the impossible shot with enough time and effort. Now I just had to do it to see if that's true. Throughout the process I also saw how great 3D anime can look, but there was a crucial part of the way I've created these projects so far that I would have to change to reach that level myself. A while ago I showed this shot to a professional anime compositor. I said I wanted to recreate it in 3D and he said that it would be impossible. The sketchy lines, the shapes morphing over time, the hand-drawn VFX on top, you can't really recreate that in 3D. Well, I tried it anyway, and this is how it went. My goal is to master the art of 3D anime, and this project showed me that after 2 years, I'm still just getting started. And it all started with this still frame right here. I created this in my last video where I tried to remake a bunch of different shots from the anime. This single frame was what I needed to prove that creating this shot in 3D was technically possible. Because if I can create one frame, I should also be able to create the rest. So with this frame as my starting point, I began blocking out my animation. For that, I used this 3D model of Luffy, which I also created in my last video. For this first step of the process, the main goal is to capture the basic movement and shapes of the original by adjusting the bones that move the model. Even though it might not look like it, this is one of the most important steps in this whole project. Every other step will build on top of this one, so the better it looks, the better the following steps will look, and the better the final animation will look. So, to make sure that it turns out well, I used the original animation as a guide by placing it over my 3D scene with transparency. The most important part to get right was this body, so I started by animating that. Afterwards, I animated the other objects like his shirt and hat. And that's where the limitations of my 3D skeleton quickly became obvious. His shirt is flying all over the place in the original, but with how I set up Luffy's skeleton, I can't really recreate that. So in this case, I tried to recreate the original as well as possible before it was time to break through our first barrier. As you may have already seen, Luffy's face looks kinda weird. His original face actually looks like this, but that looks nothing like the original, so I had to adjust it by pushing and pulling until it looked right. Well, from the camera's perspective. But luckily, that's all that matters. And with the animation block out finished, I can now improve it even more with this adjustment technique called shape keys. Unlike the skeleton, which is limited by how its bones are set up, the only limitation for shape keys is the structure of the actual 3D model. If you look at these two cubes, for example, they look the same. But when I apply a shape key to both of them and stretch them out, this one looks much smoother than the other. But why? Well, this one has more geometry, which means that as long as it has enough geometry, we can make any adjustments to this model that we want. Closing eyes, stretching his arms, or dislocating his neck. Whatever it is, we can do it now. And so the goal was to finalize the 3D model of Luffy by adjusting it for every single frame. Sometimes these adjustments are pretty simple, and sometimes they are a bit more extreme. But with every single one, it looks a little bit more like the original. Even the shirt can be fixed now. Before, the top half was glued to his body, now it can be moved to wherever it needs to be. It also looked way too straight compared to the original, which has all these waves in it. With shape keys, we can finally add those waves to the 3D model as well. And slowly but surely, it's coming together. So now that the shapes of the model look good, there's one more thing we can do to improve it even further. If you compare the current 3D version to the original, there are a few things that are still missing, like the hair and smoke, and we will add those soon. But ignoring those things, there's one big element that we haven't touched yet at all. In the original, it gives the whole shot depth, mood, and a sense of direction. In our 3D scene, it's very static and physically correct, but that's not really what we need here. What I'm talking about is the shading. Right now it might be accurate, but since everything else is stylized, it just looks kind of weird. You can never really make it look good on all elements at the same time, so we would need a way to light each element individually. And luckily, we can do exactly that with light groups. We just have to create a light, assign it to a group, and only objects that are part of the same group get affected by this light. So, by creating a separate light for each element, we can perfectly control the lighting of the shot and recreate the one from the original as best we can. And this is almost everything you can do in 3D to recreate the original. No changes I could make now would get the shot significantly closer. We have once again reached this limit that we need to break through to push further. And if you have watched my previous video, you probably know what comes next. There are a bunch of elements that are still missing entirely. One of those is the line art. There are a couple of ways to add line art in Blender, and the easiest one in this case is by using the grease pencil. With the grease pencil, you can basically draw in 3D space, but you can use it for more than just digital vandalism. One way is to use it to automatically create line art. It basically looks at the scene from the camera's perspective and places a line wherever it sees a clear contour. It doesn't do it perfectly, but the great thing about it is that we can then manually adjust it afterwards. We can remove unnecessary lines or add more where we need them, but that is just the beginning. We can also add the hair and smoke now. Creating organic elements like this with 3D geometry is very difficult, almost impossible if you want to fully recreate the look from the original. But with the grease pencil, you can add those things pretty easily by drawing them into the 3D scene. And we don't have to stop there. The 3D model already looks pretty good, but we can make it even better with some grease pencil adjustments. The shading can now become much more organic and intentional. And where before it was smooth and glitchy, now it looks much more organic and natural. The smearing, which is imitating motion blur, already exists in the 3D model, but now we can make it even more detailed. For the first part of this animation, I decided to use a 3D model to create the teeth. In the second part, I just switched the mouth color to white and added the teeth lines with the grease pencil. The last thing missing are the effects. The glowing coming from his chest, these sparks when he claps his hands, now they can be drawn in full detail. And that is something I've realized, especially after this latest 3D anime project. You could argue that since I'm using 2D elements, saying that I recreated it in 3D isn't fully accurate. I think whether that's true or not depends on your opinion. How many 2D elements are acceptable before it can't be considered 3D anymore? 40%? 20%? None at all? Whatever it is, when it comes to recreating a scene one-to-one, there is a workflow that can do that the best. And because of that, I actually thought that I had reached the limit of what is possible with 3D anime, until I found this video. This is a cinematic from a One Piece video game, and this isn't the only one. There's another one for Naruto. Both of these have found a way to create 3D animations that look almost completely 2D. And what's even crazier is that they are used in mobile games, which have way more limitations than what I have done so far. Seeing these animations has opened my eyes to what's possible in the realm of 3D anime. And the main thing that has been holding me back, I think, is that I always try to recreate each anime scene as closely as possible. But if you were combining 2D and 3D, the shot would probably not look exactly like this, because your range of possibilities is just much bigger. This isn't a one-to-one recreation, it's a reimagination. I'm already getting excited thinking about reimagining iconic anime moments like this one or this one in a style like this. So if you would love to see that too, let me know in the comments below. Maybe even with some suggestions for what scene you would like to see. But now, without further ado, here are the final 2 parts of the scene that I recreated. Creating the whole thing would have easily taken at least twice as long, so I decided to only create the 2 most distinct moments. Also, just for fun, here's what these scenes look like from outside the camera's perspective. And if you watched up to this point, you'll probably like this video as well. So, why don't you watch that next?